Hi, everyone. I just had the privilege of interviewing Jess Selingo. His book just came out on Tuesday. It's called Who Gets In and Why, and it's all about the U.S. college admissions process. Please listen to the interview. Some highlights that I will include here are, did you know that when you get an email from a college admissions office, they track if you've gone to the link and where you go thereafter. And they use that to gauge your level of interest because they will not give you an offer if they think you will not accept it. So you need to show your interest, and that is one way of doing it. Another snippet is they use nomenclature like the glue student. Is this the student who may not necessarily be a leader in everything he or she does, but maybe they are somebody who brings everybody together, the community builder, and they have examples of that within their application. So please listen to the interview, especially as we go into a very confusing college application process. We discuss everything from meritocracy to tuition to equity issues. It's not that long. I promise you it'll be beneficial. Thank you. Jack, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and my viewers during this very busy time. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
The release of your book just came out on Tuesday, and we were just catching up beforehand. And Jeff is already, he's had a feature in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times. He's going to be on CBS This Morning next week, a review in the New York Times. He's going to be in the Atlantic. I mean, it's a phenomenal book. I'm going to hold it up again.
Thank you so much.
And I don't want to get the word of who gets in and why. It's a really fun cover. I love the color yellow. So if I can even keep it here, I don't really have a stand here, but I would love to.
Well, there's one behind me. So.
Oh yes, everybody focus in over on the left side of the screen. But I think it's really, especially for now, right? The topic is really relevant. We're kind of coming to this point in our society where we're trying to figure out the relevance of college and disaggregating for all these variables that we're talking about, including equity, meritocracy, and just, basic tuition, right? We have this issue now where so many schools are going remote. What are we paying for? So it's a whole host of things. And I kind of feel like our society's grievances are really being illustrated at our higher education level. So, and at the same time, we have all these students now who are applying to college. And it was brilliant. I really admired how you were able to, in the beginning of your book, and in the afterward talk about, you added, I imagine after the bulk of the work was done, add kind of COVID response today to what higher education is doing and how students should be looking at it. But what are students looking at now? Because there is a lot of talk about how it's going to be so much more competitive to get in. The Common App changed their questions, right, to be COVID relevant.
Yeah, they added a COVID question.
They added, right? So I'd love to talk about everything in your book, which would take until tomorrow at least, but related to what's going on today, if we could do that. But just to go back very quickly, how did this book come to be?
So a couple of years ago, I read a great book that was published back in 2000 by Jack Steinberg, who at the time was a New York Times higher ed reporter. And he did a year in the life of college admissions called The Gatekeepers. Great book that followed Wesleyan University for a year and also followed students who were applying to Wesleyan University that year. When I reread the book, I realized just how much college admissions had changed in the last 20 years. Back then, there were paper files. The Common App was still it was popular, but it wasn't as popular as it is today. And there were no such thing as online applications. Mm-hmm. So over the last 20 years, college admissions has turned much more into a business, much more where marketing is a bigger piece of it, where students are applying not just to 2 or 3 colleges like they did back then, but to 8 or 10 colleges. And it's just a much more competitive world. And I really wanted to take a look at college admissions in the modern era, but also look at institutions beyond just one set of, selective liberal arts college is what he looked at in terms of Wesleyan. So I picked 3 institutions that led me into their process: a big private, urban private in Emory, small liberal arts college in Davidson, and then it was important for me to get a big public in there at the University of Washington, because 80% of students in the United States go to public universities. So I wanted to, and then I also wanted to look at these other levers that are being pulled in the admissions process by people outside of it that students and parents never see. The SAT and the ACT, the direct marketing companies, the financial aid consultants, the rankings. Those were things that Jack didn't cover really in his book. And I wanted to show parents, that is really impacting the playing field that your son or daughter is going to play on. And at the end, it influences who gets in and why.
So I'd like to peel that back a little bit, because you do a really good job in the beginning of your book talking about how when you applied to college, it was this way. And now the kids who are applying to college have a different experience, just like you mentioned. Well, here, how old are your kids now?
My kids are, they're about to turn 9 and 11.
Okay. So you have, so this is good prep work for you as well. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is it's when you talk about college admissions, you're talking about not only the parents, right? But you're also talking about Gen Z. Yep. They're Gen Z still, right? So when you talk about this window, your book, I believe, right, is educating a large demographic, right? Because it's not only the high school kids, but it's the parents. And in the beginning of your book, you talk about, because I remember, and you write about this in your book, we would get all these brochures, yeah, right, from all these colleges. Some you'd heard of, some you hadn't. You had this anecdote about a student getting an email from Princeton, elated, maybe she was getting recruited, but ultimately she didn't get in. It was just a marketing, I don't know what you call it, a promotional email. But can you talk very briefly about, because I do want to get into the meat of things, but it sets up such a good example of kind of the corporatization. And
it is really, they're like any other business in terms of marketing. They're trying to build their funnel. And so as they want to get as many students into that funnel at the beginning, so that at the end they have enough people who apply, who would get accepted and eventually say yes. So it's all about that funnel at the beginning. And how they do that is they buy names. Buy names mostly from, and it's going to be a little different this year, from the SAT and the ACT. So when you take the SAT, ACT, you fill out a questionnaire, you opt in. Most kids do opt into this marketing. And then colleges and universities buy from the SAT, ACT, 45 cents a name, these names. And they could say, I want all the kids from Virginia who scored a 1250 and above, or whatever it is. They put all these parameters around it. They get these names and then they send to them. The average student's name, amazing stat, sold 17 times. Sometimes names are sold 60 times. So I talk a lot about that in the book. Like, why do some kids get more mail than others, even if they grow up in the same neighborhood, went to the same high school? It's all these parameters that make a difference. But you're right that schools are really, in some ways, trying to build that funnel. Just because they send you email doesn't mean, or mail, doesn't mean they necessarily want you. But when you're 18, you haven't really purchased a lot. You don't get a lot of mail from marketing companies, right? And so they think, wow, Princeton wants me so much, I'm going to apply. And so then they just really get you to apply only to deny you.
So can you talk about how that relates to you? Because you talk about this later in the book as well, the yield, the percentages.
It's a very important marker for colleges and universities. They don't want to waste too many acceptances on students who will never come, especially if you're a selective college or university. Your selectivity is based on how many students you admit. So you don't want to admit too many. And less selective colleges have to admit many, because they don't get many students who say yes to them, right? So students are applying to 8 or 10 schools, you only could go to 1. So clearly they're saying no to 7 or 8 schools at the end. And so you want to be that school that accepts the student and they mostly say yes. So at a Harvard, for example, 80, 90% of the students who get accepted say yes. So Harvard has a very low acceptance rate and a very high yield. That's exactly what you want, because that shows your popularity. And so most colleges and universities are really trying to up this yield, because that is a sign of popularity. If you could up that number, and there's a lot of mechanisms that they use through their marketing and even through the admissions process, that is a sign that you have made it.
So tell me, how does it relate to the student though? Because let's say I am that student who gets 50 different, solicitations from different schools, and maybe I am that kid who never got mail before. I'm so excited. And then I'm thinking, okay, well, my friend's applying to 12 schools, my other friend's applying to 20. And then it's a game for the school, right? Because it
is a game for the school. And this is where it hurts the student, because if they don't think you're going to come, they'll reject you. And that's, so a lot of schools take into consideration what they call demonstrated interest. Mm-hmm. If they don't think you're interested in them, they will more likely reject you than accept you and put up with a denial from you, right? In other words, they would rather deny you than you deny them as the applicant. And that's really important.
So Jeff, I'd love to hear from you some stories that you illustrate in the book too, but maybe just one or two where the student was able to show that love of the school.
Yeah. So what it really, where it really helps is a couple of areas. One is if you're on the website, to be, clicking around, particularly if you got an email from them, they track all that stuff now. So if you get an email from them, that's a tracking link. They put a cookie on your web browser, and then they are following you around to figure out what you want and how interested you are. Same with social media. When you're able to get to campus, engaging on campus tours and things like that. There was an instance in the book where a student was really interested in a college, happened to be absent from high school the day the admissions rep came to school, and was denied because they thought he wasn't interested because he didn't show up to the admissions rep when they came to the school. So the counselor had to send his record from high school that showed, he literally was in school every day. He almost had perfect attendance except for that one day. And then a couple of weeks later, his acceptance comes in the mail from that school. So again, it shows just how interested they are and how interested you are in them. And so the more you can do to show that interest, the better off you're going to be at the end of the day.
I love some of the nomenclature that you use. You talked about the glue, the glue.
Yeah, they call these glue students.
The glue students. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you do dispel the myth that rarely do the admissions officers hold up two applications and say this one versus this one,
No.
And they look at a more holistic picture of the class. And we hear that. I remember in doing some research too. I went to several college admissions open houses, and that's what they talk about. Can you talk a little bit more about those types of people that they look at?
Yeah, so what they're looking for are the types of students that not just are leaders, clearly they're interested in leadership ability, but they're looking for those students who also will help connect the networks on campus. The students who don't necessarily want to be president of the club, but will be that worker bee in the club, or will help bring students together, will help them cooperate. So there's this great essay or great recommendation from a counselor for a student at Davidson that the committee is discussing. And they talk about how the school was on a field trip, that senior class was on a field trip, and the thing was a complete disaster. And people were kind of freaking out. The students were freaking out. A lot of things were happening. And this student was the student who kind of was the problem solver, helped bring people together, not a natural leader, but as they called the student, the glue student. Or often the glue student is somebody who will be be on sports team, but an English major, right? So the idea is, how do you try to connect various communities across the campus? Again, it doesn't have to be the outward leader, not the captain of a team or the president of the class. They're looking for those students who sit in the background, but don't just sit in the background. They're not spectators. They're active participants, but they don't necessarily always have to be in the leadership position. Those types of students, the problem solvers, the creative thinkers, they really want them. And those are the students they're looking for often in the class.
Which brings me to, and now we'll get to the more relevant. I'm sorry if you hear my dog kind of in the background.
Oh, that's not what kind of dog you have.
I have a German Shepherd.
Oh, great. We have an Australian Labradoodle.
Oh, so cute.
He's very cute. Yeah, he just turned a year old last week.
That's the best. Ours is quite old, 14.
Yeah.
So,
but
I would love to talk to you about we talk about, or actually people often ask me about, how is this high school? Is it a good high school? How do you compare? And they always talk about, right? You get this all the time, I'm sure. Well, look at the college placement. They put this many kids into this university, the Ivy League and MIT and Stanford, and then and they say, okay, well, disaggregate right now for legacy connections, athletic recruits, and that kind of stuff. And so I would love to talk to you about some of those things. I mean, there's some shocking things that there's research that you bring up, right? How you talk about, when you talk about recruited athletes, right? A majority are white, actually, and that dispels the myth that mostly they're recruited socioeconomically disadvantaged students, for example. Or, can we talk about some of that? I'd love for you to bring up, any kind of more salient research when we talk about these equity issues that are so important today, about how the socioeconomically disadvantaged in our society really are so disadvantaged in more ways than we can imagine, including how you talk about although now it's test optional, right? The SAT, ACT scores are typically lower.
I mean, the SAT, ACT score at the bottom line is they are a measure of somebody's bank account. That's really what it is. There's such a clear correlation between family income and the SAT, ACT. Obviously, because of high schools and other disadvantages that many students are at. But the other thing about the SAT and ACT is you do better the more often you take it. And so the wealthier you are, the more often you're able to take it. So that's one reason why those scores are so much better. And schools before this year, of course, were allowing students to super score, which meant they were curating their life and able to take the best scores that they had. So that even advantaged the wealthier who were able to take the test more often, even more. I mean, it's interesting. I live in DC, and I live in a neighborhood, to be honest with you, that's extremely on the left side of politics. And but when you talk about college admissions, the conversation sometimes changes because it's all about, well, how do I get my kid into fill in the blank highly selective school? And when you start to have those conversations, that's when policies, national public policies that most people on the left would support, helping first-gen kids get to college, helping low-income kids get to college, helping students of color get to college, right? Suddenly now their position changes a little bit because they want to make sure that other kid doesn't take a spot away from their son or daughter, right? It's very much of a zero-sum game. And what I keep reminding people throughout the book is I'm trying to give my own kids that same advantage. I get it, right? But my kids are incredibly advantaged. No matter where they go, they're going to be fine. And when we look at the most selective colleges, they are, and we see this from research over and over again, largely white, largely high income. They've become more diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, but largely still very high income. Most of the top colleges in this country still take people just from like the top 2 income quintiles, right? So we are not the meritocracy that we claim to be in higher education. And so what I remind people is that you think that, and you see these cases with Harvard around affirmative action and things like that, you think that elite colleges are just as diverse as the country is in so many ways, and they're not. And so I want to keep reminding people of that if you're in a privileged position, try for elite colleges. I'm not going to tell you not to, but no matter where first of all, your kids are not going to go nowhere to college. They're not going to go to, if you care about the rankings, the school ranked 500, they're going to go to a really good place, most likely. Will it be number 1? Probably not, but it's going to be very good. And then you're going to have the social and economic capital to push them into whatever you want to push them into. So they're going to be fine. And I keep reminding parents of that.
Then why do you think there is such an obsession with getting into a top school now? Because
it's the scarcity argument, right? These are schools, there's only 200 selective schools in this country. So we have the universe of four-year college, we have 5,000 colleges in the US, but if you think of the universe of four-year colleges, most of us think about there's about 1,400 of them, but only 200 of them are selective, meaning they accept fewer than 50% of their students. So some people might not even say that is that selective. Super selective, there's a dozen that admit under a 10% of their students. And it's that scarcity argument. So we all want to have something that we can't have. And so that's one of the reasons. And second, we're worried about the future and especially about our kids. And are they going to end up on the right or wrong side of that economic divide? We know that a college degree matters so much to success in this life. And we think that the signal of a degree from an elite selective college matters even more. And so we want to pull out all the stops to get them there.
Yeah. So I'd like to go back. You mentioned the word meritocracy. And you write about this, right? This myth of the U.S. meritocratic ideal, and how I think you had a line that said something like, "We want it, but I don't think we'll ever get there."
Yeah, well, first of all, it was never, higher ed was never a meritocracy, right? It never will be.
Yeah. And I'm one of those people who I'm too idealistic, right? I hope it's going to be that way. And I lived in countries where it was meritocratic, but then again, you had an all or nothing, high stakes exam, subject specific, that got you in there. And maybe it was a step level, it was one exam and then they filter and then another. But here you have all these different variables, right? And I believe maybe it was in the afterword, you talked about the significance of the essay and how actually it's the classes you take and the grades you get in those classes that are the most important. So can you touch a little bit about that on that in terms of now I think, the common rhetoric right now is, okay, so the tests are optional. My extracurriculars are out the door.
Yep.
My grades, I don't know what they mean because we're remote. I don't even know if I'm going to go in person at all. So what do you think matters now?
Really, it's what has always mattered. Parents and students were more in love with the standardized tests than college officials ever were. They used them, but they didn't use them as much as I think we think they use them. What they always cared about was that high school transcript and those grades. So when they opened up a file, the application materials all come into a file on a student. The first thing they would look at is the curriculum that the student took. So what are all the courses they took? They would pull up something called the high school profile that accompanies every application. Basically tells you what is available at that high school. 40,000 plus high schools in the US, they differ greatly. Some offer 20 or 30 APs, some offer 0. So they wanted to know in the context, they're looking at the context of this student in that school. And if you go to a great school, you should be taking advantage of everything offered to you, particularly if you want to major in math and science. You better have a lot of math and science on that curriculum, and then do pretty well in them, right? They're looking for high grades, that you challenged yourself and you did well in challenging yourself. So that's constantly what they're looking at. It's where their eye keeps going. It's really where they start the conversation about the student. Because if you're not there, if you haven't met that bar, you're not going to meet the bar around essays, recommendations, and things like that. And again, they're looking at it in the context of your school. So if you only it's not like they're counting APs. And if they are, if you went to a school that offered 30 APs and you took 10, great. But if you only went to a school that offered 4 and you took all 4, that's even better. So that's what they're looking for in the context of that. Did you get off over the bar in the context of your school?
And I guess the last big topic I want to bring up with you is tuition. Right, because now there's all this talk about, is it worth it? What am I getting for this 60,000 K plus per year tuition? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting to me that at this moment, when I was working on this book and you talk to students about what they're looking for in a college education, they're looking for a residential experience in a specific place, geographic place. And they've now lost both of those things. They're not on campus, or they're not on campus all the way. And some of them are not even in the same city as their college right now, taking their courses. So the two things that higher education is selling are gone for most students. Now, college leaders will tell you, well, we're selling is the education piece of it. But most students don't think they're necessarily buying that. They're buying the social, the networking, the signaling of the degree, the more elite place they go to. And so as a result, they think, why am I paying $60,000 to take Zoom classes? Because really that 60,000, maybe only 10% of it or 20% of it was for the classes. The rest of it was for this experience that I'm not getting. That's why I think we're seeing this kind of disconnect right now between college leaders and students, because college leaders think, well, what you're really paying for is that classroom experience. We're still providing that to you, not physically, obviously, but we're still providing that to you.
That makes perfect sense. So I guess, is there anything that I failed to discuss that you'd like to add to this conversation?
No, it's been great. Thank you so much for having me on.
I really think this is so relevant for our right now, and I'm sure that everybody really should know this information, and we'll see what changes take place.
I hope so. I hope some do take place. I think that colleges and universities will learn a lot through this process this year, and I think that some of these things will end up sticking.
I hope so. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thank you so much.